One of the songs that was popular when I was in high school, that has managed to stick around for almost half a century, is a tune by the Scottish band Stealers Wheel called Stuck in the Middle with You, which includes the memorable lines, "Clowns to the left of me, jokers to the right, here I am, stuck in the middle with you." A pandemic anthem well before its time, don't you think? I did. As I worked on my sermon this week, only to be reminded that Ginger referenced that song in her first virtual sermon back in March. But since March feels like it was 5 years ago and not 5 months ago, the song bears repeating because we're still stuck, or so it seems. As August begins, we have gone almost 5 months since we last worshipped in our meeting house or chatted at coffee hour. I'm way behind on my NHQ, my necessary hug quota. Because of my knee surgery in April of 2019, which sidelined me from cooking for most of the summer, our barn has gone almost a year without people gathered around our table for dinner. How I wish we could be together so that we could share what we miss and the griefs, yes, plural, the griefs we are holding. Whatever stories we are telling in these days of protest and pandemic, they are grief stories, stories of being stuck in the middle without resolution and too often without each other. I'm grateful to find that the lectionary passage was the story we most commonly know as the feeding of the 5,000, which you may not know is a grief story of its own. Our reading starts in the middle of things, as lectionary passages often do. The first sentence Ginger read is the giveaway. And hearing this, Jesus withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place to be by himself. And hearing this, my English teacher comes out of me and I want to write in the margins, what is the antecedent? Well, the first 12 verses of chapter 14 give us the context. The short version is, John the Baptist was murdered by Herod on a drunken whim. His disciples buried him and then came to tell Jesus. And hearing this, Jesus did all he could to get away from everyone and everything, to grieve the loss of his cousin, his colleague, and his friend. But he couldn't get away. The crowds of people hoping for healing were relentless in both their need and pursuit of him, and they followed him out of town into the desert, as did the disciples whom I imagine were doing their best to deal with their grief over John's death, as well as Jesus' sorrow, which was new to them as well. When Jesus became aware of what was happening, Matthew says, he was moved inwardly with compassion for the crowd. Instead of continuing to try and run away, Jesus turned back into the mass of people and began to listen to their grief stories, to share their loads, and to offer healing. This went on all day into the evening. The disciples' response was a little less compassionate, though I think they were trying to help. We're out here in the desert, and it's after supper. Don't you think you should send them back into the villages so they don't starve? Part of being a disciple, it seems, meant to live with the grief of inadequacy, which was wearisome, I'm sure. Jesus' response was direct. They don't need to go away. You give them something to eat. The disciples shot back equally as straightforward. We have nothing but these 5 loaves and 2 fishes. In Matthew's version, they don't even have a cute little kid with a sack supper. They just knew they didn't have enough. The hunger of the crowd wasn't something they could solve. It didn't matter what they did. It was late in the day. They couldn't fix the problem. Send everybody home. Bring them here to me, Jesus said. And so they brought him lunch. And then he turned to the crowd and asked everyone to recline, as they would for a meal. For our purposes, we will also imagine that they were masked and appropriately distanced. He blessed the food, and then he gave it to the disciples to distribute. With several thousand people on a hillside, it's hard to grasp the logistics of it all. But the people seemed to know that dinner was being served. They sat down and began to pass the food as it came to them. What started as 5 loaves and 2 fish turned into something where everyone ate and there were leftovers. The willing suspension of disbelief has always come fairly easily for me, so I've never had much of a problem with taking the miracle stories of Jesus at face value, or as one of my seminary professors used to describe them, as parables in event, which is to say, the miracle of this meal is pointing to something other than an amazing set of circumstances. The state of my life when I read the story, though, often affects what I see in it. These months we have spent in quarantine, where many have turned mask wearing into a violation of their constitutional rights somehow, have helped me to see that the miracle in this story is that a whole mountain of grieving people looked beyond themselves and fed one another. I don't think Jesus necessarily knew how it was all going to work out when he started handing out the fish. He just knew it was the right thing to do. If you have food and you see hungry people, you feed them. You offer what you have and then see where it goes. The lectionary passage, as Ginger read, stops with the count of how many were fed. And in doing so, leaves the story too quickly, which I might add, lectionary passages often do. But the next verse, verse 22 says, "Then he insisted that the disciples embark into the boat and precede him to the other side until he should dismiss the crowds." The day that had begun for Jesus with an ambush of grief that had sent him searching for self-isolation ended with him being not quite ready to leave after dinner was over. You go on, I'll catch up. I just want to say goodbye to everybody. And yes, I realize that is an extrovert's take on the story. Still, I think Jesus found something healing there as well. As the disciples walk down to the water, in my sacred imagination, I can hear Jesus humming, "Clowns to the left of me, jokers to my right." And then they went on to the next day, which held new grief of its own and some old stuff as well. Jesus didn't take care of people or tell the disciples to feed the crowd because it made everything better. Healing people that day didn't bring John back to life. Handing out fish and bread didn't eradicate or even lessen the Roman occupation. But they were the right things to do, the hopeful things to do on that hillside. Václav Havel was a playwright who became the president of Czechoslovakia in the late 80s. He told of something that took place just a few weeks before he unexpectedly became a head of state. He was out in the Czech countryside at a dinner party and somehow fell down a sewer pipe. In his words, he almost drowned in the fundamental mud, but someone had the wherewithal to get a long ladder and they saved him. That he was in a sewer and that he became a state official both seemed equally absurd circumstances. With both in mind, he wrote about hope. Hope in this deep and powerful sense is not the same as joy when things are going well, or willingness to invest in enterprises that are obviously headed for early success, but rather an ability to work for something to succeed. Hope is definitely not the same thing as optimism. It's not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something makes sense, regardless of how it turns out. It is this hope, above all, that gives us strength to live and to continually try new things, even in conditions that seem as hopeless as ours do here and now. In the face of this absurdity, life is too precious a thing to permit its devaluation by living pointlessly, emptily, without meaning, without love, and finally, without hope. We have more days ahead than we can imagine when we are not going to know how long this is going to last, or what is going to happen next, or when life will feel recognizable again. The days ahead are also going to leave us feeling like the disciples, I think, more often than not, when it comes to how what we think we have to offer stacks up against the needs around us. Whatever happens, even in life beyond the pandemic and the quarantine and the protests, life is not going to feel like the life we think we remember. But Jesus, to use Havel's words, didn't do what he did because he knew it all turned out okay. He did it because he was certain it made sense. He was certain it made sense to share what food they had. He was certain it made sense to stay and talk and to listen. One of the verses of our song for today says, trying to make some sense of it all, and I can see it makes no sense at all. Is it cool to fall asleep on the floor? Because I don't think I can take anymore. So much of life right now doesn't make sense, from the virus to the vitriol in our national discourse. Truly, there are clowns to the left of us and jokers to the right. The world feels full of naysayers and nut jobs and ne'er-do-wells in pretty much every direction. It doesn't make sense to keep screaming at each other. It doesn't make sense to just wish we could go back to normal, whatever that was. It doesn't make sense to just hunker down and take care of ourselves and leave everyone else to fend for themselves. What does make sense is to do all we can to let those who are stuck in the middle with us know that we are all wonderfully and uniquely created in the image of God and worthy to be loved. What does make sense is to see these days as open space that offer us the chance to change how we treat one another on both personal and societal levels. We're stuck in the middle together. What makes sense is to offer all that we can, all that we have, to a hungry world. What does make sense is to feed one another any way we can, even the clowns and the jokers.